The Richest Man Who Believed. The Faith and Giving of John D. Rockefeller. Stephen Gowley. Introduction, a letter before the ledger. Before you meet the man, I want you to meet the question. Somewhere in your life, you have probably heard his name attached to words that were never meant to sound like a compliment. Tycoon. Monopolist. The richest man who ever lived. Newspapers spent decades painting John D. Rockefeller as a portrait of everything faith warns us against: greed dressed in a suit, ambition with no ceiling, a man who built an empire on the backs of others and called it success. I am not writing to argue that portrait away entirely. He was a hard businessman in a hard era, and there is truth in parts of what history remembers. But there is another Rockefeller, one the headlines rarely had room for, and the newsreels never thought to film, because it happened quietly, in church pews and mission halls and the private pages of a ledger he kept from the age of 16 until the day he died. This is the story of that man. Not the tycoon. The believer. He was raised by a mother who taught him, before he ever earned a dollar, that the dollar was never fully his to begin with. He gave a tenth of his very first paycheck, when he had almost nothing, and he never stopped, not when he had almost everything. He buried the woman he loved and kept believing. He was mocked, investigated, and vilified, and he kept believing. He built churches whose names most people will never know, funded missions he never visited, and gave to strangers he asked never to be thanked by. By the time his life ended, he had given away, by some estimates, more than $500 million, in an era when that number defies easy translation into anything we understand today, and he had done it the same way he gave that first tenth, quietly, faithfully, and without needing anyone to see. Here is why his story matters to you, specifically, and not just as history. It would be easy to read a book like this and walk away thinking, well, of course he could afford to believe. Of course faith looked easy from inside that kind of fortune. But that gets the order backwards. He did not start believing because he became rich. He became who he became because he never stopped believing, starting from a place that looked nothing like wealth at all. A widowed household stretched thin by an absent father. A first job that paid almost nothing. A young man with no name, no fortune, and no guarantee that any of it would ever change. If you are reading this from a season that looks more like his beginning than his ending, that is not a coincidence. That is the point. This book will not ask you to admire Rockefeller from a distance, the way you might admire a statue. It will ask you to walk beside a boy with a ledger and a dime, a young husband with more faith than capital, a grieving man who kept giving even when giving hurt, and to notice, at every turn, that the God who met him in those moments is not a God who changed addresses. He is not harder to reach now than he was in a rented pew on Erie Street in 1855. If God multiplied what one believing man was willing to give, from nothing, before there was any fortune to speak of, then the question this book leaves you with is not really about Rockefeller at all. It is about what you are holding onto right now, and what might happen if you finally let it go. Turn the page. Let's begin where he began. Part I, Before the Fortune. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Had Almost Nothing. The house in Richford, New York was small, white, and full of a silence that had nothing to do with peace. It was 1839, and inside that house, a woman named Eliza Davison Rockefeller had just given birth to her second child, a boy she and her husband named John Davison Rockefeller. He would grow up to be called many things by many people: industrialist, monopolist, the richest man in American history. But in that farmhouse, in that first hour of his life, he was simply Eliza's son, and that fact alone would shape him more than any fortune he would ever build. There was little in the way of wealth in that household, and even less in the way of certainty. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, filled a room the moment he walked into it, when he walked into it at all. He was a peddler, a self-styled healer who sold bottled tonics with promises stretched further than any medicine could keep, and a man who was, by every honest account, more often gone than home. He called himself Dr. Rockefeller, though he had earned no such title, and he moved through towns the way a storm moves through a field, memorable, disruptive, and gone before anyone could fully take stock of what he'd left behind. For the children left at home, that meant a childhood defined as much by absence as by anything present. There were seasons when William's trade brought money into the house, and seasons when it brought nothing at all, and a boy growing up inside that unpredictability learns something most children never have to learn so early: that comfort is not something you can count on staying. He was not without warmth. William doted on his children when he was present, brought home gifts, told stories that made his sons laugh. But his affection came with a lesson attached, and it was not a gentle one. He made a habit, by his own later admission, of striking hard bargains with his own sons in small trades and dealings, not because he needed to win, but because he wanted them sharpened by it. "I trade with the boys," he once said, "and I just beat 'em every time I can. I want to make 'em sharp." It was an education in vigilance: trust carefully, because even the people who love you may take advantage if you let them. The family moved often through John's early childhood, from Richford to Moravia, then to Owego, chasing whatever direction William's restlessness pointed toward next. Each move meant new schools, new neighbors, new starting points, and through all of it, young John carried a quiet awareness that the ground beneath his family was never entirely solid. There were practical realities behind the family's instability that went beyond William's personality alone. He was, for a period of his life that the family rarely discussed openly, living something close to a double life, traveling under the alias Dr. William Livingston in certain dealings, a detail that would only become widely known decades later, long after John had become a public figure in his own right. Whatever the full truth of his father's activities during his long absences, the practical effect on the household was the same: a family that never knew, from one season to the next, exactly how stable their circumstances actually were. John, as the eldest son, absorbed responsibilities early that many boys his age would not have carried. He tended the family's animals, helped with the garden that supplied much of what the household ate, and was, by the accounts of those who knew the family in these years, notably serious for his age, more comfortable with quiet responsibility than with the carefree play that occupied most of his peers. Teachers who taught him in these early years described a boy who was careful, methodical, and unusually attentive to detail, qualities that would later define his entire approach to business but that were, in these early years, simply the survival habits of a child who had learned that carelessness had consequences. The moves the family made, from Richford to Moravia to Owego, were not adventures. They were, in most cases, necessities, driven by financial pressures or by circumstances involving William that the family did not discuss with outsiders. Each new town meant a new set of neighbors to win over, a new school to adjust to, and a fresh reminder that permanence was not something this family could take for granted the way other, more settled households could. It would be easy, from a distance, to see only the hardship in this. And there was real hardship in it. But there was something else being formed in that uncertainty too, though John could not have named it yet, a hunger for something steady. Long before he had any money to organize, he had already learned to crave order, structure, a floor that didn't move. He simply did not yet know where he would find it. He would find it, as it turned out, in his mother. Chapter 2. The mother who taught him to believe. If William Rockefeller was the storm, Eliza Davison Rockefeller was the ground that held after it passed. She was a devout Baptist, and her faith was not a Sunday habit, it was the architecture of the entire household. With William gone for weeks and sometimes months at a stretch, it was Eliza who held the family together, 6 children, a farm's worth of chores, and a set of convictions she repeated so often they stopped sounding like lessons and started sounding like law. Waste nothing. Give first. Owe no one. She was strict, known to discipline her children firmly when they earned it, and famously, she would sometimes send a misbehaving child to go select the very switch that would be used, a small but pointed lesson that a person is responsible for the consequences of their own choices, not merely subject to them. But her strictness was never separate from her faith, it flowed directly from it. She believed, plainly and without complication, that everything a person had, their time, their strength, their money, belonged first to God. A person did not truly own anything. They held it, for a while, and they would answer one day for how they had held it. This was not an abstract theology to Eliza. It was a daily practice. In a household stretched thin by William's absences, she still found a way to set money aside for the church before anything else was spent. She modeled, long before John understood what he was watching, that giving was not something you did after your needs were met. It was something you did first, on faith that the rest would follow. It would be simple to make this a story of a villain and a saint. William the schemer, Eliza the believer. But young John did not grow up choosing one parent over the other. He grew up absorbing both. From his father, he learned to read a room, to negotiate without flinching, to see opportunity where others saw risk. From his mother, he learned that none of that meant anything without something governing it from above. Sharpness without faith, he would come to believe, was simply appetite. An appetite, left ungoverned, was the very thing that had made his father unreliable. Eliza raised her children on scripture recited so often it became instinct rather than memorization. She taught them that God saw what was done in secret, that a gift given for recognition had already received its full reward, and that a gift given quietly was still seen, and still mattered, even if no one on earth ever knew about it. It was a lesson John would return to again and again in the decades ahead, long after his mother's voice had gone quiet and his own name had become known across the country. Eliza ran the household's finances with a precision that would look, in hindsight, like a direct rehearsal for the ledger her son would one day keep. Every expense was tracked. Every debt was avoided wherever possible, since Eliza held a deep suspicion of borrowed money, a conviction she stated plainly and often, that a family which owed money was, in some real sense, no longer fully free, since its choices were now bound by an obligation to someone else. "Owe no man anything," she would say, quoting the book of Romans, and she meant it as a practical instruction for the household ledger as much as a spiritual principle for the soul. Sunday mornings in the Rockefeller household followed a fixed pattern that never wavered regardless of the family's circumstances that particular season. Hymns were sung together before the walk to church, scripture was read aloud by whichever child was old enough to read clearly, and the sermon that followed was discussed afterward around the table, Eliza asking her children what they had understood from it, gently correcting misunderstandings, reinforcing the parts she believed mattered most. Faith in this household was never treated as something absorbed passively. It was practiced, questioned, and returned to, week after week, in a rhythm that shaped John's entire understanding of what a life ordered around God actually looked like in daily practice. She was also, by every surviving account, a woman capable of real warmth alongside her strictness, and it would misrepresent her to describe her only in terms of discipline. She nursed sick neighbors without being asked. She took in extra mending work during the leanest seasons rather than let her children go without, and she did this quietly, without complaint, treating the extra labor as simply what needed to be done rather than as a hardship worth dwelling on. Her children absorbed this too, that faith was not merely about correct belief, but about a certain steadiness of character that showed itself most clearly not in comfortable seasons but in difficult ones. By 1853, the family had settled near Cleveland, Ohio, and John, now a teenager, was beginning to step out from under his parents' roof and into a world that would soon test everything both of them had taught him. He would carry his father's sharpness into rooms full of businessmen who would try to outmaneuver him, and he would need every bit of it. But it was his mother's God he carried into those same rooms, quietly, and it was that God, not the sharpness, that would determine what kind of man he became once the fortunes started to arrive. He did not know yet what he would build. He knew only, with a certainty his mother had planted deep and early, who it would ultimately belong to. If you are reading this and you grew up in a home that felt more like William's than Eliza's, unpredictable, more absence than presence, take this with you before the next chapter begins. The faith that shaped Rockefeller's whole life did not come from having a perfect family. It came from one steady voice that refused to let go of what was true, even when everything else around him was uncertain. You may only need one voice like that in your own life, even now, even if it's the only steady one you've ever had. Chapter 3. 16 and Looking for Work. Cleveland, Ohio, in the spring of 1855 was a city on the move, and John D. Rockefeller, 16 years old and freshly finished with what little formal schooling his family could afford, was determined to move with it. He had studied briefly at a business college, learning the fundamentals of bookkeeping, a skill that seemed unglamorous to most boys his age but suited him perfectly. He liked precision. He liked columns that balanced. He liked the idea that a page of numbers, kept honestly, could tell you the truth about a business more clearly than any conversation could. It was, in its own quiet way, an extension of the discipline his mother had built into him: order, honesty, accounting for what you had and what you owed. Finding a position, however, proved harder than he expected. Cleveland's merchants and trading houses were not eager to hand real responsibility to an unproven teenager, however tidy his handwriting or sharp his arithmetic. For weeks, John walked from office to office along the docks and warehouses of the city, asking for work, and receiving, more often than not, polite refusals or no answer at all. He did not quit. Each morning he put on his one good set of clothes and went out again, applying to firm after firm, absorbing rejection with a patience that would come to define nearly everything he did later in life. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no single moment where a door swung open. There was only persistence, day after day, until finally, in September of 1855, a small commission merchant and produce shipping firm called Hewitt and Tuttle agreed to give him a chance. It was not glamorous work, and at first, it was not even paid work. For weeks, John simply showed up, sat where he was told, and did what was asked, without wages, in the hope that the position would eventually become real. Many young men would have walked away from an arrangement like that, unwilling to work for nothing. John stayed. He treated the unpaid weeks the same way he would later treat every dollar that passed through his hands, as an investment made on faith, before there was any proof it would pay off. The date itself, September 26, 1855, was one Rockefeller remembered with striking precision for the rest of his life, a fact that says a great deal about how much that day meant to him. Decades later, as one of the wealthiest men in the world, he still referred to it privately as his own kind of anniversary, more significant to him in many ways than birthdays or holidays, since it marked the day he considered his real working life to have begun. The office of Hewitt and Tuttle sat near the docks of Cleveland, in the middle of the bustling commerce of a growing Great Lakes port city, surrounded by the noise of shipping and trade that would have overwhelmed a less focused young man. John walked to the office each day along the same route, and he was known, even in these earliest weeks, for arriving before he was expected and staying later than required, not out of any instruction to do so but simply because he wanted to fully understand every part of the business he had been allowed to join, however humble his actual role remained at first. He began keeping his own private notes on expenses before he was ever asked to, a habit that predated even the famous Ledger A he would start once real wages began. Even during the unpaid weeks, he tracked, in a small notebook of his own, exactly what he spent and on what, down to the smallest amounts, a discipline that reflected his mother's household economics transplanted directly into his own independent life. It was, in its own quiet way, already a kind of stewardship, practiced before there was anything of real substance yet to steward. When Hewitt and Tuttle finally began paying him, the wages were modest, a few dollars a week, hardly a fortune by any measure. But for a boy who had grown up watching his family's finances rise and fall with his father's comings and goings, that first steady paycheck represented something far larger than its dollar amount. It represented order, predictability, a floor that, for the first time in his life, he had built with his own hands. And it was in that very first paycheck, before there was any fortune to speak of, that the habit which would define the rest of his life began. Chapter 4. The First Tenth. Hewitt and Tuttle kept its books the way a church kept its rolls, every entry a small confession of where the money had gone. And when John D. Rockefeller finally received his first real wages, he did not spend a cent of it before he had done one thing first. He opened a small book. Later in life he would call it Ledger A, and he kept it, and copies of the practice within it, for the rest of his days. On the first page, in a young man's careful hand, he began recording what he earned, and what he gave away. 10 cents on the dollar. Not as a suggestion. Not as a resolution he'd let slide by spring. As a floor. The Erie Street Baptist Mission Church took the first of it. It was a small congregation, meeting in a room that didn't yet deserve the word church so much as it deserved the word hope, a handful of families, a rented hall, a pastor stretching his own coat over too many winters. John's dime, his consistent, unglamorous, first dime, went into their offering plate the way it would go into 100 more plates over the next 70 years, without ceremony, without a name attached loud enough for anyone to remember later. This is the part the histories tend to skip past on their way to the oil fields. Before there was a Standard Oil, before there was a fortune large enough to concern senators, there was a bookkeeper's assistant giving away money he could not afford to give away, because he believed, with the same plainness his mother had taught him, that it was never really his money to begin with. He was holding it. That was all. A steward, not an owner. He would write, decades later, of a lesson he traced back to those years, that the ability to make money was itself a gift, and that a gift is measured by what a man does with it, not by what he keeps of it. It was not a philosophy he arrived at after he was rich enough to afford one. It was the seed he had already planted at 16, on a bookkeeper's stool, with a ledger that had 2 columns before it ever had one that mattered to Wall Street. He didn't know yet what he would become. He knew only what he owed, and to whom. The ledger itself survives today, preserved carefully as one of the most studied personal documents of the era, its pages showing a level of detail that goes well beyond simple record-keeping. Every entry is dated. Every recipient is named, whether a mission church, a traveling minister, a poor family in the neighborhood, or later, as his circle of concern widened, causes and institutions far beyond Cleveland. He did not give in vague, general terms. He gave to specific people and specific needs, tracked with the same precision he applied to the produce and commissions passing through Hewitt and Tuttle's own books. What is perhaps most remarkable, reading the ledger's early pages, is how the percentage he gave did not remain fixed at exactly 10 cents on the dollar as his circumstances changed. In many months, particularly as his wages grew slightly and his confidence in the practice deepened, he gave more than the tenth, not as an obligation exceeded reluctantly but as a floor he had grown comfortable building upon. The tithe, in other words, was never a ceiling for him. It was the minimum, the starting point beneath which he would not allow himself to fall, regardless of how tight his own circumstances became. He continued this exact practice, entry by entry, for the rest of his life, long after the amounts involved had grown from dimes into sums that would have been almost unimaginable to the 16-year-old boy who started the habit. He would later say, with evident sincerity, that he could trace every good thing that had happened to him in business directly back to the decision to begin tithing at the very start of his working life, not because giving away money was itself some magic formula for wealth, a superstition he explicitly rejected, but because the discipline of tracking, valuing, and releasing money faithfully had shaped every other financial decision he made from that point forward. There is a particular kind of faith required to give away a tenth of almost nothing. It is easy, and even common, to imagine giving generously once there is abundance to give from. It is a different thing entirely to give consistently when giving costs something real, when a tenth less means a real difference in what you can afford that week. That is the faith Rockefeller practiced from his very first paycheck onward, and it is the faith this book will keep returning to, not giving as a reward for having enough, but giving as the discipline that comes before enough ever arrives. Chapter 5. The Making of a Businessman. 2 years into his work at Hewitt and Tuttle, John D. Rockefeller had become something the firm had not expected when they first let an unpaid teenager sit quietly in their office: indispensable. He had a gift, it turned out, not simply for keeping accurate books but for understanding what those books actually meant, where money was being wasted, where risk was being taken without being properly weighed, where a small adjustment in how a shipment was financed could save a meaningful sum. He absorbed the mechanics of commerce the way he had once absorbed his mother's verses, not as abstract information, but as something to be lived out daily. By 1859, still only 19 years old, he was ready for more than a wage. Alongside a young partner named Maurice Clark, he launched his own commission merchant business, Clark and Rockefeller, dealing in grain, hay, meats, and other goods moving through Cleveland's busy port. The startup capital came partly from his own careful savings, built dollar by dollar from wages he had never spent as freely as he might have, and partly from a loan his father agreed to provide, at interest, a detail that says as much about William Rockefeller as any story of his absences ever could. Even helping his son start a business, William charged him for the privilege. The young firm succeeded, modestly at first and then with real momentum, aided by the enormous surge in demand for grain and provisions during the early years of the Civil War. But what set Rockefeller apart from other ambitious young Cleveland merchants was not luck or timing alone. It was a temperament, cautious where others were reckless, patient where others chased quick returns, and relentlessly organized in a business environment where most competitors operated on instinct and memory rather than careful record-keeping. He continued, through all of it, the practice he had begun at 16. As the business grew, so did his giving, not as a fixed habit frozen at 10 cents on the dollar out of ceremony, but as a proportion that, if anything, tended to increase as his means increased. He gave to the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church that had taken his first dimes, and as the congregation grew into a fuller church, his support grew alongside it. He gave to causes beyond his own congregation as well, causes serving the poor, funding for traveling missionaries, small acts of support for people he would often never meet. He carried into this new venture a memory he would return to often in later life, the financial panic of 1857, which had struck while he was still a young clerk at Hewitt and Tuttle, barely into his second year of steady work. Banks across the country failed within weeks of one another that autumn. Businesses that had seemed unshakable collapsed almost overnight, and men who had built respectable careers over decades found themselves suddenly without income, without credit, and in some cases without any way to provide for their families. Cleveland did not escape the panic's reach, and Rockefeller watched, as a teenager still learning the fundamentals of commerce, as firms around Hewitt and Tuttle folded one after another. He was not old enough, nor senior enough, to bear direct responsibility for any business during that crisis, but the experience marked him deeply. He would recall, decades later, kneeling in prayer during those uncertain weeks, not pleading for wealth or even for his own security, but asking simply for wisdom, for a clear enough mind to make sound decisions in a season when panic was pushing grown men toward foolish ones. He later described the substance of that prayer to a close associate in terms that stayed remarkably consistent throughout his life: "Lord, let me not be afraid of the numbers, but help me be honest with them, and faithful with whatever is left in my hand." It was a short, unadorned kind of prayer, closer to his mother's plain household faith than to any dramatic conversion experience, and it would become, in one form or another, the prayer he returned to at every financial crossroads that followed. What he took from 1857 was not a theory but a habit, one that would shape every business decision he made from that point forward. Debt was a chain, and a man who avoided it unnecessarily gave himself room to remain calm, and to remain faithful, when panic swept through everyone around him. It was a lesson he would need again, more urgently than he could have imagined, less than 2 decades later. The Civil War years brought a surge of demand for the grain, hay, and meat that Clark and Rockefeller dealt in, as both military contracts and general wartime disruption to normal trade routes created opportunities for a young, well-organized firm willing to move quickly and reliably. Rockefeller, still in his early 20s, found himself managing contracts and logistics at a scale that would have intimidated far more experienced men, and he approached the work with the same unhurried, methodical seriousness that had characterized him since childhood. He remained, throughout this period of rapid growth, notably cautious about debt, a conviction that traced directly back to his mother's kitchen table economics. Where many ambitious young businessmen of the era borrowed aggressively to expand as quickly as possible, Rockefeller preferred to grow at a pace his actual capital could sustain, a caution that some of his more aggressive contemporaries privately viewed as timidity, but which would prove, across the following decades, to be one of the defining strengths that allowed his ventures to survive downturns that ruined more highly leveraged competitors. His giving during these years grew in step with the business, though it never lost the personal, specific character it had carried since his very first dime. Church records from this period in Cleveland show Rockefeller's name appearing regularly among the contributors to building funds, mission support, and aid for struggling families within the congregation, contributions that, while growing in size alongside his income, remained proportionally consistent with the discipline he had begun at 16. What is notable about this period is not the size of the giving, which remained modest by any later standard, but its consistency. Business income for a young commission merchant in that era could swing considerably from month to month, season to season. A man building his first real fortune might reasonably decide to pause his giving during a lean stretch, to shore up his own position first. Rockefeller did not. The 10th, and often more than the 10th, continued regardless of how the business itself was performing that quarter. It was, in effect, an apprenticeship not only in business but in faith under financial pressure, a rehearsal, on a smaller scale, for decisions he would face again and again as the amounts grew larger and the stakes grew higher. The habits a man builds when the numbers are small are very often the habits that determine what he does when the numbers become enormous. Rockefeller understood this instinctively, long before anyone outside Cleveland had ever heard his name. He was, by the early 1860s, no longer a boy with almost nothing. He was a young businessman of real and growing means. But the ledger he kept had not changed its shape. 2 columns still. Earned, and given. And the second column, quietly, was never allowed to fall behind. Part 2, The Making of a Fortune. Chapter 6. The Discovery of Oil. In the years just before the Civil War, word began spreading across Pennsylvania of something strange happening in a quiet valley along Oil Creek. Men were pulling a black, foul-smelling liquid out of the ground, a substance long known as a nuisance to farmers whose wells it fouled, and finding that it could be refined into something the entire country suddenly wanted, a clean burning fuel for lamps, cheaper and steadier than whale oil, which was growing scarcer and more expensive by the year. The origin of the entire industry traced to a single well drilled by Edwin Drake at Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859, the first well in America deliberately drilled for oil rather than struck upon by accident. News of Drake's success spread quickly, and within a few short years, the quiet farmland around Oil Creek had transformed into a chaotic boomtown landscape of derricks, speculation, and fortunes made and lost within single seasons, an environment that rewarded recklessness far more often than it rewarded patience. Cleveland, Ohio, sat close enough to the Pennsylvania oil fields, and well enough connected by rail, to become a natural refining center almost overnight. By the early 1860s, dozens of small refineries had sprung up around the city, most of them undercapitalized, poorly run, and gambling on a commodity whose price swung wildly from month to month. Rockefeller, still building his produce commission business with Maurice Clark, watched this new industry with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to every ledger he had ever kept. He was not the first into oil, and he never claimed to be. He was, instead, one of the first to recognize that the real fortune in this new industry would not go to the man who drilled the most wells, since drilling was a gamble even the best geologists of the era could not reliably win. The fortune would go to the man who refined, transported, and sold oil more efficiently, more consistently, and more cheaply than anyone else. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of opportunity suited to his temperament. Not a gambler's opportunity, but a steward's opportunity, a chance to bring order to chaos, discipline to an industry defined by wild speculation, and in doing so, to build something durable rather than something merely lucky. In 1863, Rockefeller and his partners invested in a small refinery, joined soon after by a skilled chemist named Samuel Andrews, whose technical expertise in refining complemented Rockefeller's own financial and organizational discipline. Within 2 years, convinced that refining, not the produce trade that had built his early reputation, represented his future, he sold his interest in the commission business entirely and devoted himself fully to oil. It was a significant risk for a man not yet 30, walking away from a proven, steady business to pour everything into an industry still widely regarded as an unstable fad. He prayed over the decision at length, by his own later account, visiting his church repeatedly in the weeks surrounding the choice, seeking what he described as clarity rather than simply confidence. He did not describe some dramatic vision or audible answer. He described something quieter and, in its own way, more demanding, a settled conviction, arrived at through careful thought and careful prayer together, that this was the direction he was meant to take. Faith, for Rockefeller, was rarely theatrical. It was a discipline of discernment, applied patiently to ordinary decisions, trusting that a God who governed the smallest details of a ledger also governed the larger turns of a life. He could not have known, standing in a Cleveland refinery in 1865, still a relatively young and unproven man, that this single decision would eventually make him the richest man in the world. He knew only that the decision felt, after prayer and careful thought, like the right one. That would have to be enough. It was, for him, always enough. Chapter 7. Building Standard Oil. What Rockefeller built over the following decade was not simply a company. It was a system, and the discipline behind that system traced back, in ways he himself acknowledged, to the same principles his mother had drilled into him at the kitchen table: waste nothing, account for everything, and never spend what you have not first earned honestly. Where competing refineries operated wastefully, discarding byproducts that could be sold, running inefficient equipment, keeping careless books, Rockefeller's refineries were relentlessly precise. He hired chemists to find uses for every byproduct of the refining process. He negotiated aggressively with the railroads that shipped his oil, using the volume of his growing business as leverage to secure lower rates than his competitors could obtain, a practice that was, at the time, legal and common, though it would later become one of the central charges leveled against him. He bought failing refineries, not to strip them for parts, but often to fold their capacity into a more efficient whole, frequently offering their owners a fair price and, in many cases, a continued role in the combined enterprise. In 1870, this growing network was formally organized as the Standard Oil Company. The name itself was a statement of purpose. Rockefeller wanted to bring standardization, consistency, and reliability to an industry that had been chaotic and unpredictable, an industry where the quality of kerosene from one refinery might differ wildly from the next, sometimes with dangerous results, since poorly refined kerosene could explode in a customer's lamp. Standard Oil's kerosene was, by design, standard, safe, consistent, and dependable, batch after batch. The company grew at a pace that startled even its competitors. Within a few years, Standard Oil controlled the overwhelming majority of oil refining in the United States, a dominance achieved through a combination of efficiency, aggressive negotiation, strategic acquisition, and, at times, tactics that were hard-edged even by the standards of the era. Rockefeller did not deny the hardness of it. He believed, with the same plainness he applied to giving, that a business run wastefully served no one well, not its employees, not its customers, and not the God he believed had entrusted him with the responsibility of running it wisely. What is easy to miss, looking back only at the scale of what Standard Oil became, is how deliberately unglamorous the underlying philosophy remained. Rockefeller did not chase growth for its own sake, and he was famously suspicious of debt and speculation, principles that traced directly back to his mother's household economics. Standard Oil grew because it was efficient, not because it borrowed recklessly against a hopeful future. It was, in its financial discipline if nothing else, an extension of a ledger a 16-year-old boy had once kept by hand at Hewitt and Tuttle, now applied at a scale that boy could never have imagined. The severest test of this discipline arrived in September of 1873, when the failure of a major banking house in New York triggered a financial panic that swept across the entire country within days. Credit evaporated almost overnight. Railroads defaulted. Thousands of businesses, many of them refineries not unlike the ones Standard Oil competed against every day, collapsed entirely within months, unable to meet obligations they had taken on during more confident times. It was, by most measures, the worst economic crisis the young nation had yet faced, and it landed directly on an oil industry that was already unstable, overbuilt, and vulnerable to exactly this kind of shock. Standard Oil was not immune to the panic's pressure. Revenues fell. Customers delayed payment or defaulted outright. For a period of real uncertainty, the company's own solvency, and Rockefeller's personal fortune along with it, was genuinely at risk, not through mismanagement but through the simple, indiscriminate force of a national economic collapse that spared almost no one in commerce. Rockefeller later described these months as among the most testing of his entire business career, a season in which the outcome of decades of careful work suddenly felt uncertain, hanging on decisions that would need to be made with incomplete information and very little room for error. It was in this season that his private prayer life, described later by those closest to him, took on an almost daily discipline. He rose early, before the demands of the day could crowd it out, and spent time alone in scripture and prayer before ever looking at the company's books. The substance of those prayers, as he recounted them afterward, was not a plea for the crisis to simply pass, but something closer to a request for steadiness. Father, do not let fear make my decisions for me. Give me a clear head and an honest hand, and whatever is left standing when this is over, let it be built on something true. He would say, decades later, that he did not experience these prayers as dramatic or emotional. They were, in his own description, plain and repeated, the same handful of requests returned to morning after morning, until the crisis had passed. What carried Standard Oil through the panic was precisely the caution that had shaped the company from its earliest days: minimal debt, substantial cash reserves, and a refusal to overextend even during the industry's most confident, expansionary years. While dozens of competing refineries collapsed outright during 1873 and the difficult years that followed, unable to meet obligations taken on during more optimistic times, Standard Oil not only survived but found itself, by the crisis's end, in a position to acquire several of those failed operations at a fraction of their earlier value, often at the request of their own desperate owners, who saw acquisition by Standard Oil as preferable to total collapse. Rockefeller did not treat this outcome as evidence of his own cleverness alone. In letters to family members written during and after the crisis, he returned repeatedly to a conviction that the discipline which had preserved the company, discipline he traced directly back to his mother's household economics and to the lessons of the 1857 panic he had witnessed as a teenage clerk, was itself a form of faithfulness that had been, in his understanding, honored rather than merely rewarded. He did not believe God had caused competitors to fail so that Standard Oil could benefit. He believed, more simply, that faithfulness in ordinary financial discipline, practiced patiently over many years before any crisis arrived, was what had allowed the company to remain standing when the storm came, exactly as a house built on rock outlasts one built on sand. And through all of it, the second column of that original ledger, the giving, did not shrink. It grew, quietly, alongside everything else. Chapter 8. The Price of Power. Success at the scale Standard Oil achieved did not come without a cost, and the cost was not only financial. As the company's dominance grew through the 1870s and 1880s, so did resentment toward it. Independent refiners who had been bought out, sometimes willingly and sometimes under considerable pressure, told their stories to newspapers eager for a villain. Railroads that had granted Standard Oil favorable rates were accused of colluding against smaller competitors. State legislatures and eventually the federal government began investigating the company's practices that were, in that era, largely legal but that struck many Americans as fundamentally unfair, a single company growing so dominant that genuine competition became difficult to sustain. Rockefeller became, in the process, one of the most publicly vilified men in America. Political cartoonists drew him as an octopus, tentacles wrapped around state capitals and courthouses. Journalists, most notably Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been a casualty of the oil industry's brutal early competition, published detailed, damning investigations of Standard Oil's methods. The word trust, which Standard Oil's legal structure had helped popularize, became a symbol of everything Americans feared about concentrated corporate power. For a man raised on his mother's conviction that wealth was a stewardship, not a possession, this public reckoning posed a genuine spiritual challenge. It would have been easy, and perhaps understandable, to grow defensive, bitter, or withdrawn in the face of such sustained public hostility. Rockefeller's private correspondence from this period shows something else, a man wrestling honestly, in prayer and in conversation with his pastors and advisers, with whether the criticism contained truth he needed to hear, even as he believed much of it was unfair or exaggerated. He did not, by most accounts, believe himself to be without fault. He acknowledged, later in life, that the competitive practices of the era, his own included, had at times been harder and less generous than they should have been. But he also maintained, consistently and without much public defense of himself, that the underlying purpose of his work, bringing order and efficiency to a chaotic industry, had been a genuine good, however imperfectly it had sometimes been pursued. What faith gave him during this period was not immunity from criticism. It was a foundation that did not depend on public opinion to remain steady. He continued his giving through the very years his public reputation was at its worst, continued attending his Baptist church in New York, continued teaching Sunday school to young men in his congregation, a habit he maintained for decades even after he could easily have withdrawn from public religious life to avoid scrutiny. He did not hide his faith to protect it from association with his business reputation. He kept both in plain view, and let each stand or fall on its own. One story from the Sunday school class, recounted by several of its members in later years, captures something of the man that the newspapers never printed. During a week when a particularly damaging investigative piece had run in the national press, one of the young men in the class asked Rockefeller directly, with the bluntness only a student can get away with, whether the accusations were true. Rockefeller did not deflect the question or dismiss it. He answered slowly, acknowledging that some of the criticism contained real truth he needed to sit with, and reminded the class that no man's character, his own included, should be measured only by his best moments, but that the measure that mattered most was not what any newspaper printed, but what God alone fully knew. He then continued the lesson as planned, the same steady, unhurried manner he brought to every session, whether the week's headlines had been kind to him or not. He faced formal legal questioning as well during this period, called to testify under oath in various state and federal investigations into Standard Oil's practices. Those who observed his testimony, including reporters who arrived hoping to see the great tycoon rattled or exposed, consistently described a man who remained calm, deliberate, and unfailingly polite under even the most aggressive questioning, offering careful, precise answers and declining to speculate or exaggerate in either direction. This composure, which some critics read as evasiveness, was, by the account of those who knew him personally, simply the same unhurried discipline he brought to every other part of his life, a refusal to let pressure dictate his words any more than panic had ever been allowed to dictate his business decisions. Chapter 9. The Richest Man in America. By the 1890s, John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune had grown to a scale that had genuinely never existed before in American history, and arguably never in human history to that point, once adjusted for what that wealth could actually purchase and control. Estimates of his peak net worth, calculated in today's terms, regularly place him as the wealthiest individual in modern history, wealthier by a considerable margin than any tycoon, industrialist, or entrepreneur who has followed him since. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of that fact, because the man carrying that fortune did not live the way the public imagined a man of such wealth would live. Rockefeller's personal habits remained, by the standards of his era's other titans, notably restrained. He was not known for extravagant spending, elaborate parties, or the kind of conspicuous consumption that many of his fellow industrialists indulged in. His health, strained by decades of relentless work and the stress of constant public scrutiny, had actually begun to decline seriously in his 50s, to the point that he lost most of his hair and suffered from digestive troubles that forced him to adopt a famously simple diet. By some later economic estimates, his fortune at its peak, calculated as a share of the entire American economy at the time, exceeded 1.5% of the nation's total annual output, a proportion no individual American has approached since. And yet his daily table, by the account of household staff and family members alike, remained almost austere. Crackers and milk were a staple of his diet for years following his health crisis, and he took evident satisfaction in the fact that his wealth had not required him to abandon the plain habits his mother had instilled in him as a boy. The fortune itself, in other words, had not brought him the ease it might have promised. If anything, it had brought a different and heavier kind of burden, the responsibility of deciding what should be done with an amount of money so large that mismanaging it carelessly could do genuine harm, either by enabling laziness in those who received it thoughtlessly, or by going to waste through poor stewardship. This is the tension that sits at the center of this entire book, and it is worth naming plainly here, at the moment his fortune reached its peak. A man raised to believe that everything he had belonged first to God now possessed more than any person in American history had ever possessed. The scale had changed almost beyond recognition. The question his mother had planted in him as a boy giving away his first dime had not changed at all, What do you do with what has been entrusted to you? Rockefeller did not arrive at an answer quickly or easily. The 1890s were, by his own account and the accounts of those close to him, a period of genuine spiritual wrestling, not over whether to give, since the habit of giving had never left him, but over how to give well at a scale where careless generosity could do as much harm as careless greed. He had watched wealthy men before him give foolishly, funding causes without oversight, enabling dependency rather than genuine help, and he was determined not to repeat those mistakes simply because his intentions were sincere. It was out of this wrestling that the next chapter of his life, and the next chapter of this book, would emerge, not simply a rich man giving money away, but a believer working out, with real seriousness, what it meant to be a faithful steward of more than any steward before him had ever been asked to manage. Chapter 10. Wealth and the Question of God. There is a parable Rockefeller returned to often in his private writings and in conversations with his pastors, the parable of the talents, in which a master entrusts his servants with sums of money before departing on a journey, and later returns to see what each servant has done with what was given him. The servants who invested and multiplied their portion are commended. The servant who buried his portion out of fear, doing nothing with it, is rebuked, not for losing money, but for wasting the opportunity entrusted to him. Rockefeller read his own life through that parable, and it shaped his understanding of wealth in a way that set him apart from many of his wealthy contemporaries. He did not believe his fortune was primarily his to enjoy. He believed it was primarily his to multiply, and then to release, wisely and deliberately, for purposes larger than himself. Wealth that simply accumulated, untouched and unused, was, in his theology, closer to the buried talent than to faithful stewardship, regardless of how legally or honestly it had been earned. This conviction placed him in a genuinely difficult position as the 1890s wore on. He was, by then, the target of intense public suspicion, and any large gift he made was liable to be read cynically, as an attempt to buy back a reputation the newspapers had spent 2 decades tearing down. He gave anyway, and increasingly he gave in ways specifically designed to avoid that appearance, through intermediaries, through boards and foundations rather than personal announcements, and in many cases with explicit instructions that his name not be publicly attached to the gift at all. He began working closely, during this period, with a small circle of trusted advisors, most notably a Baptist minister named Frederick Gates, to bring the same rigor to his giving that he had once brought to Standard Oil's ledgers. Gates pushed him to think of philanthropy not as scattered charity, responding to whichever request arrived that week, but as a discipline in its own right, requiring the same careful analysis, the same demand for measurable results, and the same intolerance for waste that had built his fortune in the first place. It was, in a real sense, his mother's ledger scaled up to a size she could never have imagined, and run with the same unsentimental rigor his father had taught him in business, now aimed entirely outward, toward causes larger than himself. 2 inheritances, still working together, decades after both parents had passed. The chapters that follow this one will trace where that giving went, and what it built. But before turning there, it is worth sitting for a moment with the question Rockefeller himself sat with, at the height of his fortune, in the quiet of his own conscience, not whether God had blessed him, since he never seriously doubted that he had, but whether he was being faithful with what that blessing had become. The turning point in this wrestling arrived in the form of a letter from Frederick Gates himself, written around 1905, warning Rockefeller in the starkest terms available that his fortune was, by then, growing faster than any individual could responsibly give it away through ordinary means. Gates wrote that the fortune was rolling up like an avalanche, and that Rockefeller would be crushed under it, his family disgraced, unless he distributed it faster than it continued to accumulate. It was not a comfortable letter to receive, but Rockefeller took it, by every account, with the same seriousness he had once brought to a 16-year-old's ledger, and it accelerated a shift already underway in his own private prayer and reflection toward organized, deliberate, large-scale giving rather than the case-by-case approach that had served him for decades. If you have ever been given more than you know what to do with, whether that is money, time, opportunity, or simply more good fortune than you feel you have earned, this is the same question waiting for you that waited for him. Not what you have been given. What you intend to do with it. Part 3, The Man Behind the Fortune. Chapter 12. Laura. She was not the kind of woman newspapers wrote about, and that, more than anything else, was exactly the kind of woman John D. Rockefeller had been raised to look for. Laura Celestia Spellman, known to nearly everyone close to her as SETI, grew up in Cleveland in a household not unlike the one that had shaped Rockefeller himself, devout, disciplined, and deeply committed to the idea that faith was meant to be lived rather than merely professed on Sundays. Her father, Harvey Spellman, was an abolitionist and a man of considerable moral seriousness, active in causes of conscience long before such activism was fashionable or safe. Her mother shared that same conviction. The Spellman household ran, in its own way, on the same principles Eliza Rockefeller had instilled in her son: give generously, live simply, and let your faith show itself in what you do rather than what you say. John and SETI met as students, both strong in their studies, both serious beyond their years, and both, by every account of those who knew them, unusually well matched in temperament. Where many courtships of the era were built on charm and social performance, theirs seems to have been built on something quieter, a shared sense that life was meant to be taken seriously, that faith was not a decoration but a foundation, and that a marriage, like a business or a ledger, ought to be built with care rather than left to chance. They married in 1864, when John was 25 and already deeply immersed in building what would become Standard Oil. From the very beginning of their marriage, SETI was not a passive figure standing beside a rising businessman. She was, by nearly every account from those who observed the marriage closely, his intellectual and spiritual equal, a woman capable of engaging seriously with the moral questions his growing wealth would eventually force him to confront. Some biographers have suggested that Rockefeller's caution around alcohol, his opposition to dancing and theater going, reflected SETI's convictions as much as his own, and it is true that she held her own strong opinions on such matters. But it would be a mistake to read this simply as one spouse deferring to the other. It was, more accurately, a marriage of two people who had arrived, independently, at very similar convictions about how a life devoted to God ought to be lived, and who found in each other a partner who would not need to be persuaded of what they already believed. What is striking, reading their correspondence from these early years, is how frequently faith appears not as a separate topic from their daily life but as the very language in which that daily life was discussed. Decisions about the household budget, about how much to give and where, about how to raise the children who would soon arrive, were discussed in explicitly spiritual terms: what would be faithful, what would be wise stewardship, what would honor the trust they believed had been placed in them. Seti was, if anything, the more outspoken of the two on matters of principle. She held strong convictions about temperance and about the responsibilities of wealth, and she was known, within the privacy of their household, to push her husband toward positions more demanding than he might otherwise have settled into on his own. This partnership would prove essential in the decades ahead, as Rockefeller's fortune grew to a scale that tested the character of nearly everyone who came near it. Wealth on the scale Standard Oil eventually produced has a well-documented tendency to isolate a person, to surround him with those who want something from him rather than those who will tell him the truth. Seti was, throughout their marriage, someone who told him the truth. She was not impressed by the fortune for its own sake, and she made sure, in ways both direct and indirect, that it did not impress their children either. Their early years together were not without real hardship. Money, in the first years of the marriage, was tighter than the later fortune would suggest, since Rockefeller's capital was tied up in the businesses he was building rather than sitting in comfortable reserve. They lived modestly, in a house that was respectable but hardly extravagant, and Seti managed the household with the same careful, unwasteful discipline that had characterized both of their upbringings. Guests who visited the Rockefeller home in these years, and even for decades afterward, once the fortune had grown enormous, frequently remarked on how ordinary the household felt, how little ceremony surrounded a family that could, by then, have afforded nearly anything. This was not accident. It was conviction, held jointly by two people who believed, with equal seriousness, that comfort easily curdled into complacency, and that a family entrusted with unusual wealth bore an unusual responsibility not to let that wealth define who they were. Seti was, in this sense, not merely a supportive spouse standing beside a great man. She was one of the architects of the very restraint and stewardship that would come to define the Rockefeller name, a partner whose faith matched his own closely enough that neither ever had to choose between loving God and loving each other. If you have ever wondered whether faith can survive contact with real partnership, whether two people can hold each other accountable to something higher without that accountability curdling into control, their marriage offers a quiet answer. It can. It did. And it would be tested, in the years ahead, far more severely than either of them could have imagined on their wedding day. Chapter 11. The Habit of Prayer. Every chapter to this point has shown prayer arriving at a crossroads, a decision about oil, a financial panic, a fortune grown too large to hold comfortably. It would be a mistake to leave the impression that prayer, for Rockefeller, was something reserved for emergencies. It was not a fire alarm he reached for only when the house was burning. It was closer to breathing, constant, unremarkable, and so woven into the ordinary rhythm of his days that those who lived alongside him rarely thought to comment on it, the way no one comments on a man remembering to eat breakfast. The Rockefeller household, from the earliest years of his marriage to Seti through the raising of their children, kept a fixed pattern of family worship that never depended on how busy the day ahead promised to be. Mornings began with scripture read aloud, a short passage, rarely more than a chapter, followed by a prayer offered aloud, spoken plainly, without theatrical flourish or borrowed eloquence. Evenings closed the same way. Guests who stayed in the household, even decades later when the family's wealth had grown almost beyond comprehension, remarked with some surprise at how ordinary these devotions felt, no different, in substance or tone, from what might have been heard in any modest Baptist farmhouse in Ohio 40 years earlier. Grace before meals was never skipped, regardless of who was present or how significant the business being discussed that day. Associates who dined with Rockefeller on matters of enormous financial consequence, mergers, negotiations, decisions affecting thousands of employees, described the same brief pause before the meal began, a short, unhurried word of thanks, spoken by Rockefeller himself when he was the host, acknowledging the meal and, more often than not, the people gathered around the table, before a single course was served. It was not performed for the benefit of onlookers. Those closest to him noted that he prayed the same way whether the table sat 2 or 20. His personal prayers, the ones offered alone rather than at the family table, followed a habit he described later in life as having begun in earnest during his teenage years under his mother's roof, a set time, usually early morning before the demands of the day could crowd it out, spent first in scripture and then in unhurried, unscripted prayer. He did not describe elaborate or mystical experiences in these times. He described something closer to conversation, an ongoing, daily accounting not unlike the ledger he had kept since he was 16, except that this ledger recorded not dollars given but a life examined, what he had done well, where he had fallen short, what he was carrying that felt too heavy to carry alone. He was, by multiple independent accounts from business associates and family members alike, a man who prayed specifically rather than vaguely. He did not simply ask God for blessing in general terms. He prayed over named decisions, named people, named troubles, in the same careful, itemized manner he brought to every ledger and every negotiation. A troubled business partnership, a sick employee, a wayward young man in his Sunday school class, each received its own particular mention, not folded into a generic request for the world's improvement. This specificity extended to his giving as well, and the two habits, prayer and giving, were never fully separable in how he approached either one. Before committing to a major gift, whether a modest contribution to a struggling mission church in his younger years or, decades later, the founding of an institution that would cost millions, he prayed over the decision with the same seriousness he had once brought to the choice of whether to leave the produce business for oil. He wanted, by his own account, not simply to feel generous, but to be certain the gift was wise, that it would be received well, and that it reflected genuine stewardship rather than a passing impulse toward generosity that felt good in the moment but accomplished little of lasting value. His approach to prayer also carried a marked absence of self-pity, even during the years of his harshest public criticism. Correspondence and recollections from those close to him in the worst years of the Standard Oil controversy show a man who prayed for wisdom to respond rightly to criticism, and for the humility to hear whatever truth it contained, rather than praying primarily for vindication or for his critics to be silenced. This was not, by his own admission, always his first instinct. He acknowledged, in later reflections, that anger and defensiveness were real temptations during those years, and that prayer functioned, in part, as the discipline that kept those instincts from governing his public conduct. Perhaps the clearest window into his prayer life comes from his decades of teaching Sunday school, a practice he maintained with striking consistency across an adult lifetime otherwise consumed by the largest business empire in the world. He opened nearly every class in prayer, and those who sat under his teaching, many of them young men with far less money and far more struggle than their teacher, described these prayers as notably personal, attentive to whatever specific difficulty a student might be facing that week, a sick parent, a lost job, a crisis of faith brought on by hardship. He prayed, in other words, the way he gave, specifically, attentively, and without any apparent need for an audience to notice how well he was doing it. What follows is not a prayer that survives in his own handwriting, and no claim is made here that these are his exact words. It is offered instead as this book has offered every dramatized scene before it, built carefully from everything the record shows about how he actually prayed, specific, unhurried, more grateful than anxious, more concerned with faithfulness than with outcome. If Rockefeller ever knelt and put into a single prayer everything these pages have shown about his convictions, it might have sounded something like this. The prayer of a billionaire. Lord, you knew me when I had nothing but a dime and a ledger, and you have not changed since then, even though everything around me has. Thank you for the mind to work, the hands to build, and the years to see what that work became. None of it was ever mine to keep. I have only ever been holding it. Forgive me for the seasons I gripped it too tightly, and for the hardness that crept into my dealings when I let ambition outrun conviction. Give me the wisdom to give wisely, not merely generously, so that what passes through my hands leaves something standing rather than something merely spent. Keep me from loving what you have entrusted to me more than I love you who entrusted it. Let the fortune serve the faith, and never the faith serve the fortune. When they praise me, remind me of the mission hall on Erie Street. When they curse me, remind me that you alone weigh a man's heart. And when it is finally time to lay all of it down, let it be said, not that I was rich, but that I was faithful with what you gave a poor man's son to carry. Amen. If you have ever wondered whether a life devoted to something as demanding as building the world's largest company leaves any real room for a genuine, daily walk with God, or whether the two must inevitably compete for the same limited hours, Rockefeller's own habits suggest an answer worth sitting with. He did not treat prayer as a luxury reserved for quieter, less consequential lives. He treated it as the quiet architecture beneath every consequential decision he ever made, present so consistently that almost no one thought to write it down until much later, when they finally understood how much of what he built had actually been built on it. Chapter 13. Raising a Family with a Fortune. By the 1870s and 1880s, John and Zettie Rockefeller were raising a family inside a paradox that few parents in history have ever had to navigate. How do you teach children the value of a dollar when their father controls more dollars than any man alive? 5 children were born to the marriage, though tragedy touched the family early. Their first child, Elizabeth, known as Bessie, was followed by a son who died in infancy, a loss that struck both parents hard and that neither spoke of often in later years, though those closest to them said Zettie carried it quietly for the rest of her life. Alice, Edith, and John Jr. followed, and the household that raised them was, by design, almost defiantly ordinary. The most famous illustration of this is the ledger system Rockefeller instituted for his own children, a direct echo of the one his mother had taught him and the one he himself had kept since he was 16. Each child was given a small allowance, modest even by the standards of ordinary middle-class families of the era, let alone a family of their means. And each child was required to record, in their own small notebook, exactly where every penny went, so much earned, so much saved, so much given away. A portion, following the pattern set generations earlier at the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church, was expected to go to charity as a matter of course, not as an occasional gesture but as a fixed habit, the same discipline their father had practiced since before he had any fortune to speak of. Children could earn additional money through chores and small responsibilities around the household, killing flies for a few cents 100, tending a small garden plot, keeping their own shoes polished, tasks that would have been unremarkable in any working family in America and were made deliberately unremarkable in the Rockefeller household as well. Visitors to the family's homes, whether the relatively modest house in Cleveland or the larger estate later built at Pocantico Hills in New York, frequently remarked on how little the surroundings signaled the family's actual wealth. The furniture was comfortable but not opulent. The meals were simple. The children wore practical clothing, often patched and handed down between siblings the way any large family's clothing would be. This was not frugality performed for an audience. Few outside the household ever saw it, since Rockefeller deliberately kept his family life out of the press as much as such a public man possibly could. It was, instead, a conviction shared fully by both parents, that wealth handled carelessly could destroy a child as surely as poverty could, perhaps more surely, since poverty at least forces a kind of discipline that unearned comfort never has to develop on its own. John D. Rockefeller Jr., the only son, bore perhaps the heaviest weight of this upbringing, since he was the child most clearly being prepared, without ever being told so directly, to eventually carry forward both the business empire and the philanthropic vision his father had spent decades building. He was raised with the same ledger discipline as his sisters, sent to the same modest schools, taught the same expectation that faith, not fortune, was the true inheritance being passed down. He would later describe his childhood as happy but serious, a household where laughter was real but where certain expectations were never in question. Family worship was a fixed part of daily life, mornings and evenings both, scripture read aloud, prayers offered by each family member in turn as they grew old enough to participate. Sunday was kept, without exception, as a day of rest and worship, church in the morning, quiet activities in the afternoon, no business discussed regardless of what pressing matters might be unfolding at Standard Oil that week. This was not mere habit. It was, for both parents, a weekly reminder to their children, and perhaps to themselves as much as anyone, of the order of priorities that had built the family's fortune in the first place: God first, then family, then the work that supported both. It would be easy to imagine that a family with such resources could simply purchase whatever character they wished to see in their children. Character, as any parent knows, cannot be purchased. It has to be practiced, patiently, in small daily decisions repeated over years, the same way a young bookkeeper once practiced giving away a dime he could not really spare. John and Seti Rockefeller understood this instinctively, and the household they built, quiet, disciplined, and unmistakably rooted in shared faith, was their answer to a question very few parents in history have ever had to face at such an extreme scale: what do you do when you have been given everything, and you still want your children to understand what it means to have nothing to prove? Chapter 14. The Man the Newspapers Hated. If there was a single decade in which John D. Rockefeller's public reputation calcified into the caricature that would follow him for the rest of his life, and long after, it was the first decade of the 20th century. In 1904, a journalist named Ida Tarbell published a sprawling, meticulously researched work titled The History of the Standard Oil Company, serialized first in McClure's magazine before being collected into book form. Tarbell's work was not without personal motivation. Her own father had been a small oil producer in Pennsylvania, one of many independent operators whose businesses had struggled or failed as Standard Oil consolidated its dominance over the industry. Her account, exhaustively documented, painted a devastating portrait of a company, and a man, who had built an empire through practices that ranged from aggressive but legal to, by most modern readings, genuinely predatory, secret railroad rebates, deliberate price wars designed to bankrupt competitors before buying them out at a fraction of their worth, and a level of market control that left many Americans wondering whether genuine competition could survive at all in an economy where one company controlled so much. The public response was immediate and lasting. Political cartoonists, who had already been sharpening their pencils against Standard Oil for years, found in Tarbell's work an entire arsenal of new material. Rockefeller was drawn, again and again, as a bloated spider at the center of a web, an octopus with tentacles wrapped around state legislatures and courthouses, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure counting coins while ordinary Americans struggled. The word Rockefeller itself became, in common usage, nearly synonymous with everything the public feared about concentrated wealth: greed without conscience, power without accountability, success built on the ruin of smaller, more honest men. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken apart under federal antitrust law, ruling that the company's dominance violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The ruling was, in the public imagination, a vindication of everything Tarbell and others had argued. Ironically, the breakup made Rockefeller personally far richer than he had been before, since he retained proportional shares in each of the newly independent companies, and several of those companies, freed to compete and innovate on their own, grew even more valuable than the unified Standard Oil had been. The public saw this outcome, understandably, as further proof that the man simply could not lose, that even the government's best efforts to rein him in only made him wealthier. What almost none of this coverage captured, because it was never designed to look for it, was the private man living underneath the caricature. Throughout this entire period, the very years his public reputation reached its absolute low point, Rockefeller continued teaching his weekly Bible class at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church in New York, a practice he had maintained since his younger years and would continue for decades. The class was not a ceremonial appearance. He prepared for it seriously, studied the passages in advance, and engaged the young men in his class, many of them far from wealthy, with genuine warmth and attention. Members of that class, interviewed decades later, consistently described a teacher who was patient, humble, and startlingly ordinary in manner, nothing like the caricature the newspapers were publishing about the very same man in the very same years. He also continued, throughout this period, a private giving practice that had by then grown enormous in scale but remained, wherever possible, anonymous in delivery. Letters requesting help arrived at his offices by the thousands each year, and a dedicated staff, under his direction, worked to evaluate and respond to as many as could be reasonably assisted. Widows received unexpected assistance. Struggling churches received funds to keep their doors open. Individual families facing medical crises received help that arrived, more often than not, without any public announcement or expectation of thanks. He did not, by most accounts, spend much energy trying to correct the public record. He seems to have believed, consistent with everything his mother had taught him about giving in secret, that a man's actual character would eventually be known by God regardless of what the newspapers printed, and that spending his remaining years trying to manage his public image would be a poor use of time he could instead spend on the giving itself. This was, in its own quiet way, its own form of faith, a willingness to be misunderstood by an entire nation while remaining fundamentally unmoved from the convictions that had shaped him since he was a boy in his mother's kitchen. Chapter 15. When money could not save him. There is a particular kind of humility that arrives only when a man who can purchase almost anything discovers, decisively, that some things are simply not for sale. Rockefeller's own health began to fail seriously in his 50s, at almost exactly the period when his fortune and his public notoriety were both reaching their peak. He developed a condition, likely a form of alopecia brought on by the relentless stress of decades running an embattled empire while facing constant legal and public assault, that caused him to lose his hair entirely, eyebrows and eyelashes included, within a remarkably short span of time. For a man whose face had, by then, become one of the most recognized and most caricatured in America, the loss was not merely physical. He began wearing wigs, a small and human vanity that sits oddly alongside the image of the ruthless tycoon so many Americans carried in their minds. Digestive troubles compounded the problem. Rockefeller's doctors, alarmed at his declining condition, warned him bluntly that he was, by his 50s, at serious risk of an early death if he did not fundamentally change how he lived. He was, in effect, told that the very drive and intensity that had built Standard Oil into the largest company in the world was now actively killing him. It was a sobering diagnosis for a man raised to believe that discipline and hard work were themselves forms of faithfulness. And it forced upon him, whether he welcomed the lesson or not, a reckoning that no amount of money could resolve. He could purchase the finest medical care available anywhere in the world, and he did. He could not purchase his way out of the basic reality that a human body, driven relentlessly for 3 decades, has limits that no fortune can override. He made the changes his doctors demanded, gradually stepping back from the daily operations of Standard Oil, adopting a simplified diet, and, notably, taking up golf, a game he had previously regarded as an unserious use of time but which became, in his later decades, both a genuine source of daily exercise and something closer to a spiritual discipline of its own, patience, precision, and an acceptance of factors beyond one's control, values not far removed from the ones his mother had once instilled in him. There were other losses during this period that no wealth could touch. Family members fell ill. Old friends and business partners from the earliest Cleveland years passed away, one by one, as the decades wore on, a slow and steady reminder that mortality made no exception for a man who had, by nearly every material measure, exceeded what any human being before him had ever accumulated. Rockefeller's private correspondence from these years shows a man increasingly turning his attention toward questions that his fortune could not answer: what actually mattered, in the end, and what a life would be measured by once its material accomplishments were set aside. It is worth pausing here, because this is a turn many biographies of wealthy men skip past too quickly, eager to return to the more dramatic material of business empires and public scandal. But it is, in its own quiet way, one of the most theologically significant chapters of Rockefeller's life. A man who had spent 40 years building the largest fortune in human history was forced, by his own failing body, to confront directly what his mother had been telling him since he was a child: that everything he had, including his health, including his very life, was on loan, not owned, and that no ledger, however carefully kept, could purchase an exemption from that truth. If you have ever built something you were deeply proud of, only to watch your body or your circumstances remind you, sometimes cruelly, that you are not actually in full control of your own life, you are standing exactly where Rockefeller stood in his 53rd year. The lesson he took from it was not despair. It was recalibration, a decision to spend whatever years remained to him doing, more intentionally than ever, the one thing his fortune could not do on its own. Give it away, wisely, for purposes that would outlast him. Chapter 16. Losing Laura. Laura Spelman Rockefeller's health had never fully recovered from decades of frequent pregnancies, private grief, and what those close to the family described as a naturally delicate constitution that the pressures of being married to the most scrutinized man in America had not made any easier to bear. By the early years of the 20th century, she had largely withdrawn from public life, spending much of her time at the family's Pocantico Hills estate, her activities gradually narrowing as her strength declined. For John, this slow decline was, in its own way, a harder trial than any newspaper cartoon or antitrust ruling had ever been. He had built an empire capable of weathering federal lawsuits and public condemnation on a scale few men in American history have ever faced, and none of that scale of power offered him any leverage at all against the simple, unstoppable progression of his wife's failing health. He adjusted his own considerable resources around her care as fully as he could, arranging the best physicians available, restructuring his own schedule to spend more time by her side, but the fundamental reality remained entirely outside his control. Laura Spelman Rockefeller died in March of 1915, at the age of 75, after 50 years of marriage. Those close to the family described John's grief in the aftermath not as dramatic or public, consistent with how he had lived his entire life, but as unmistakably deep. He had lost not merely a wife but the person who had, from the very beginning of their marriage, matched and steadied his own faith, the woman who had helped shape, alongside him, the household discipline and giving practices that would come to define the family's legacy far beyond its business empire. He did not withdraw from his faith in the aftermath, though grief of that magnitude has broken the belief of stronger men than history often gives credit for. If anything, those closest to him in this period described a man who leaned further into the convictions Laura had shared with him for half a century, rather than away from them. His giving, already enormous by 1915, did not pause or diminish following her death. If anything, several of his most significant philanthropic decisions in the years immediately following her passing carried an unmistakable echo of causes she herself had championed during her life: education, particularly for those denied it by poverty or circumstance, and public health initiatives aimed at diseases that disproportionately struck the poor. It would be easy, and in some ways expected, for a biography to dramatize this grief, to construct scenes of a broken man wandering the halls of his estate. The more honest account, based on what those closest to the family actually recorded, is quieter and, in its own way, more instructive. Rockefeller grieved the way he had lived, privately, without theater, and with a faith that did not require public displays to remain genuine. He continued his daily habits, his simplified diet, his rounds of golf, his Bible study, not because the loss meant little to him but because those habits were themselves an expression of the same steady faith that had carried him through every previous trial of his long life. There is a particular kind of grief that does not shatter faith but instead reveals what that faith was actually built on all along. If a person's belief only survives when life is going well, it was never truly tested to begin with. Rockefeller's faith, by every account available from those who knew him in these years, was the kind that had been tested across 75 years of building, losing, being vilified, and now, finally, of burying the person who had walked every step of that journey beside him. It held. Not because holding was easy. Because it was, by then, simply who he was. If you have ever lost someone who steadied you, someone whose faith held your own steady in return, know that the ache of that loss and the endurance of that faith are not opposites. They can, and often do, live in the same heart at the same time. They did in his. Part 4, Giving Away the Fortune. Chapter 17. The Joy of Giving. There is a sentence Rockefeller wrote late in his life, quoted often since, that captures more about his understanding of wealth than any ledger entry ever could, that he believed the power to make money was a gift from God, to be developed and used to the best of one's ability for the good of mankind, and that having been endowed with that gift, he considered it his duty to make all the money he could, and to give away all he could. This was not a sentiment he arrived at only in old age, looking back with the comfortable wisdom of hindsight. It had been the operating principle of his entire life, from the dime given at Erie Street Baptist Mission Church onward. What changed, particularly from the 1890s forward, was the scale and the method. As his fortune grew into the hundreds of millions and eventually into the billions, ad hoc, individually evaluated giving, however sincere, became genuinely unworkable. A man cannot personally review, with real care, tens of thousands of requests for aid arriving in a single year while also running the largest corporation in the world. It was here that Frederick T. Gates, the Baptist minister and advisor who had first entered Rockefeller's circle to help manage denominational giving, became an indispensable partner in a new kind of philanthropy. Gates pushed Rockefeller toward what he termed scientific giving, a phrase that might sound cold applied to charity but that, in practice, meant something closer to careful stewardship applied at scale, identifying root causes rather than merely treating symptoms, funding institutions capable of sustaining themselves rather than creating permanent dependency, and demanding the same rigorous accounting from philanthropic projects that Standard Oil had always demanded from its refineries. Rockefeller embraced this approach eagerly, and it is worth understanding why, because it reveals something important about how he actually understood generosity. He did not see careful, business-like evaluation of a charitable gift as being in tension with genuine compassion. He saw it as an extension of compassion, a refusal to let good intentions waste resources that could otherwise help more people, more effectively, if given with the same discipline he had once applied to a bookkeeper's ledger at 16 years old. Giving foolishly, in his view, was not more loving than giving wisely. It was simply less faithful. The joy in this chapter's title is not a sentimental flourish. Those who worked closely with Rockefeller during these years, and there were many, since organized philanthropy at this scale required an entire staff of advisors, accountants, and program officers, consistently described a man who approached this work not with grim duty but with genuine, evident delight. Meetings about a new medical research initiative or an education grant for a struggling Southern college brought out an energy and engagement that visitors sometimes found surprising in a man otherwise known for his reserve. This, it seemed, was the part of his life's work he had been building toward all along, the reason the fortune had been entrusted to him in the first place. He once remarked to a close associate that he had never been able to discover, in all his years of business, any pleasure equal to that of giving money away intelligently, watching it accomplish something real, and knowing that it had been placed exactly where it was needed most. This was not the sentiment of a man who viewed philanthropy as an obligation to be discharged before he died. It was the sentiment of a man who had, over decades, come to believe that giving was not the end point of a well-lived life but its actual purpose, the reason the earning had been worth doing at all. Chapter 18. Building something that would outlive him. Of all the institutions Rockefeller's giving helped create, few reflect his philosophy of stewardship as clearly as the founding of the University of Chicago in 1890. Rockefeller had been approached by Baptist educators seeking support for a struggling seminary, but what emerged from those early conversations grew, under Rockefeller's own insistence, into something far larger and more ambitious, a genuine research university, built from the ground up to rival the great institutions of the American East and of Europe. He committed an initial gift of $600,000, an enormous sum for a single educational donation at the time, and would go on to give many millions more over the following decades, ultimately investing more in the University of Chicago than in any other single philanthropic project of his lifetime. What is notable about this gift, and about nearly all of Rockefeller's major educational giving, was his consistent insistence on independence. He deliberately declined to have the university named after himself, a striking decision for a man whose name was already, by 1890, one of the most recognized in the country. He likewise refused to exert direct control over the university's academic direction, insisting instead on strong, independent leadership and trustees who would guide the institution according to its own scholarly judgment rather than his personal preferences. This was, again, the same conviction that had shaped his approach to giving since childhood. A gift, once given faithfully, belonged to its purpose, not to the giver's ongoing ego or control. His educational philanthropy extended well beyond Chicago, and much of it went to causes that received far less public attention but arguably reflected his deepest convictions even more clearly. Through the General Education Board, established in 1902, Rockefeller directed enormous sums toward education in the American South, including significant support for the education of Black Americans at a time when such support was neither fashionable nor universally welcomed, even within many corners of his own denomination. Spelman College in Atlanta, a historically black institution for women, was named in honor of his wife's family, the Spelmans, whose own history of abolitionist conviction had shaped Setty's upbringing just as surely as Eliza Rockefeller's Baptist faith had shaped John's. This particular thread of giving deserves special attention, because it is one of the clearest places where the values Setty brought into the marriage visibly shaped where the family's giving ultimately went. The Spelman family's abolitionist convictions, and Setty's own lifelong commitment to causes of justice and education for those denied it, echo directly through decades of Rockefeller philanthropy long after her death. It was not John's convictions alone that built this legacy. It was the shared faith of a marriage, still bearing fruit in institutions neither spouse would live to see fully mature. Rockefeller's approach to education giving was patient in a way that distinguished it from the giving patterns of many of his wealthy contemporaries. He was not interested primarily in monuments, buildings bearing his name that would stand as visible testaments to his generosity. He was interested in capacity, endowments that would sustain institutions for generations, faculty positions that would attract serious scholars for decades to come, structures built to outlast not merely his own lifetime but the lifetimes of everyone currently living. This was, in its purest form, the theology of the talents applied at the scale of civilization itself, not simply giving away what he had been given, but multiplying it, deliberately, for a harvest he understood he would never personally see gathered. Chapter 19. Fighting Disease with a Fortune. If education represented one great pillar of Rockefeller's philanthropic legacy, medicine and public health represented the other, and in some ways, the more personally urgent one. Rockefeller had watched, across his own long life, the devastating and often entirely preventable toll that disease took on ordinary families, including, at times, his own. Medical science in the late 19th century remained, by modern standards, shockingly primitive, and Rockefeller, together with Frederick Gates, became convinced that a concentrated, well-funded, scientifically rigorous approach to medical research could accomplish for human health what similar discipline had accomplished for Standard Oil's efficiency decades earlier. In 1901, this conviction led to the founding of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, an institution built explicitly to give talented scientists the freedom and resources to pursue serious research without the constant financial pressure that had historically hampered American medical science. The institute would go on, across the following decades, to contribute to a remarkable series of genuine medical breakthroughs, work that saved countless lives over the following century, long after Rockefeller himself was gone. Perhaps even more striking, in terms of its direct and immediate human impact, was the work of the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the Eradication of Hookworm Disease, established in 1909. Hookworm, a parasitic infection spread through contaminated soil, was rampant across the rural American South in this era, contributing to widespread lethargy, malnutrition, and impaired development, particularly among poor children, in ways that had been widely misunderstood or simply dismissed by the broader public as regional laziness rather than treatable illness. Rockefeller's commission funded a systematic campaign of testing, treatment, and public education across the southern states, a campaign that would eventually treat hundreds of thousands of people and fundamentally shift the region's public health infrastructure and understanding of preventable disease. What is worth noting about this particular initiative is how unglamorous it was. There was no University of Chicago-scale monument attached to it, no building bearing a family name. It was, in many cases, quiet, difficult, unglamorous work, county health officials going door to door in impoverished rural communities, treating a parasitic infection that carried no social prestige whatsoever to be associated with. Rockefeller funded it anyway, and funded it generously, because the actual measurable impact on human suffering mattered more to him than the visibility of the cause. This same public health philosophy would soon expand internationally, as the philanthropic infrastructure Rockefeller had built began taking on yellow fever, malaria, and other diseases that devastated poor communities around the world, work that would continue and expand for decades under the eventual umbrella of the Rockefeller Foundation, carried forward long after Rockefeller's own direct involvement had given way to the next generation of trustees and scientists he had helped train and fund. There is a thread running through this entire chapter of his life that connects directly back to a Cleveland bookkeeper's stool in 1855, the conviction that a gift measured by its actual impact on real human suffering mattered more than a gift measured by its visibility or its glory. He had given his first dime to a mission church nobody outside that small congregation would ever hear of. He was, 60 years later, funding hookworm treatment for rural sharecroppers whose names he would never know and who would likely never learn where the help had come from. The scale had changed almost beyond recognition. The heart behind it had not moved an inch. Chapter 20. The Billionaire Who Became a Steward. By 1913, John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune had grown so vast, and his philanthropic ambitions so far-reaching, that the informal structures he and Gates had relied upon for 2 decades could no longer adequately manage the scope of what he wanted to accomplish. That year, Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Foundation, chartered with a mission statement of striking simplicity and equally striking ambition, to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The scale of the endowment was, at the time, without precedent in human history. No individual, in any nation, at any point in recorded history, had ever committed resources of this magnitude to organized philanthropy. And yet the structure Rockefeller insisted upon reflected the same principle that had guided every dollar he had given since he was 16 years old: the money was no longer his to direct personally, moment to moment, according to his own preferences. It belonged to the mission, governed by a board of trustees, staffed by professionals selected for their expertise rather than their loyalty to the Rockefeller name. This was, in its way, the final and most complete expression of the theology he had carried since his mother's kitchen table in Owego. A steward does not merely give away what has been entrusted to him. A faithful steward builds structures that will continue the work faithfully long after the steward himself is gone. Rockefeller understood, with a clarity that few wealthy men in history have matched, that his own life was finite, however extraordinary its material accomplishments had been, and that the causes he cared about, medical research, education, public health, would need to outlast him by decades, even centuries, if they were to accomplish everything he believed God had called them to accomplish. He gradually withdrew from direct oversight of his philanthropic empire in these years, transferring increasing responsibility to his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who had been raised, quite deliberately, with exactly this eventual responsibility in mind. The penny ledgers of childhood, the disciplined allowance system, the family worship and Sunday observance, all of it had been, whether the children fully understood it at the time or not, preparation for precisely this moment, the passing of not merely a fortune but a philosophy of stewardship from one generation to the next. By the time of his own death, Rockefeller had given away, across his lifetime, an amount of money that different historians and economists have calculated in different ways, but that consistently ranks among the largest personal charitable contributions in human history, even before adjusting for the vastly different value of money in his era compared to today. Adjusted to modern terms, credible estimates place his lifetime giving well over the equivalent of many billions of dollars, and in a percentage sense, a very substantial portion of the total fortune he ever accumulated, some estimates suggesting more than half, was ultimately given away rather than retained or passed down. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with the strangeness and the beauty of that fact. A boy who once agonized, in a very real sense, over whether he could afford to give away a dime, became, across 70 years of unbroken practice, a man who gave away more wealth than any private individual in the history of the world to that point had ever possessed to give. The habit had not changed. Only the number of zeros attached to it had. And that, more than any single institution he funded, may be the truest testament to the faith his mother planted in him, not that he became rich enough to give generously, but that giving generously, practiced faithfully across 7 decades, was what the richness had actually been for. Part V, The Legacy. Chapter 21. The Richest Man Who Believed. In the final decades of his life, John D. Rockefeller became, to the great surprise of a public that had spent 30 years cartooning him as a heartless monopolist, something closer to a beloved figure. Photographs from his winters at his Florida estate in Ormond Beach show an old man in comfortable, unremarkable clothing, playing golf nearly every day well into his 90s, chatting easily with reporters and strangers alike, a far cry from the gaunt, hollow-eyed villain of earlier political cartoons. He became known, in these final years, for a small and oddly touching habit. He carried with him, nearly everywhere he went, a pocket full of shining new dimes, which he handed out freely to children he met, and often to adults as well, a small physical echo of the very first dime he himself had given away at 16 years old, standing in a rented mission hall on Erie Street in Cleveland, more than 70 years earlier. Asked about the habit, he would explain, simply, that he wanted people to understand the value of saving something, of giving something, even from very little. It is difficult to imagine a more fitting image for a life that had, in its own way, never really changed shape from that very first act of faith, the coin, given freely, given first, before it could be spent on anything else. John Davison Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at his Ormond Beach estate, 2 months short of his 98th birthday. He had outlived nearly every contemporary from his early business career, outlived the worst of the public vilification that had once made him one of the most hated men in America, and lived long enough to see many of the institutions he had founded, the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, mature into some of the most respected and consequential organizations in the world. His estate at the time of his death was, by then, only a fraction of what his peak fortune had once been, not because the fortune had failed, but because he had spent the final decades of his life doing precisely what he had always intended to do with it, giving it away, faithfully, deliberately, and at a scale no person before him had ever attempted. He died, by design and by conviction, considerably less wealthy in dollar terms than he had been at his financial peak, and immeasurably wealthier, by his own understanding of the word, in the only currency that had ever actually mattered to him. The institutions he left behind continue their work today, nearly a century after his death: medical research that has saved untold millions of lives, universities that have educated generations of students who never knew his name, public health campaigns that eradicated diseases across entire continents. It would be easy to end this book there, with the tally of his accomplishments, the scale of his giving, the institutions that bear the fruit of his stewardship even now. But that would miss the actual point of everything this book has tried to show you. The story was never really about the size of the fortune. It was about a boy who decided, before he had almost anything, that whatever he was given would never fully belong to him alone. It was about a mother who taught that conviction through daily discipline rather than dramatic sermons. It was about a young husband who found a partner whose faith matched and strengthened his own. It was about a man who kept giving through failure, through public hatred, through grief that could have hardened a weaker faith into bitterness. And it was about a fortune that grew large enough to change the world, not because the man who built it loved money, but because he never once forgot, from his very first dime to his very last dollar, exactly whose it had always been. You did not pick up this book by accident. Somewhere in your own life, whatever its current shape, whatever season you are walking through right now, there is a ledger only you can keep. A tenth. A talent. A choice about what you do with what has been placed, however modestly, in your own hands. Rockefeller's story does not end with the astonishing size of what he built. It ends with the same quiet question his mother handed him in a small kitchen in Owego, New York, more than a century and a half ago, a question that was never really about money at all, and that now, having walked his entire life beside him, belongs to you. If God did this, with a boy who started with almost nothing, what might he do with what you are willing to give him now?